Time of great upheaval and shifting and change. That also means it's a time of opportunity, and we just have to do everything we can to seize this opportunity to right the ship and put it back on course.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Thanks so much for watching or listening. For those of you who are subscribers, thank you. You know the usual drill. I'll ask you if you have a friend who likes the show and hasn't subscribed, please do so. And you know the whole thing about giving us a 5-star rating. It's the only kind of rating we like. Most importantly, as is the case every week, because there are so many smart men and women across the world, we have a very special guest today. Yoram Hazony is someone I have gotten to know only in the last couple of years. And in the last few months, Yoram, we've had a few meetings together. And as my colleagues here at Heritage would attest, I have said you are one of my favorite people I've ever met in my life. And you are one of the kindest, gentlest souls I've encountered in my life. And in the work that you and I do, which is the work of ideas and to some extent policy and politics, where most Americans, people around the world would expect discourse to be toxic, you actually personify not doing that. Doesn't mean that you are a pushover. Doesn't mean that you and I see things identically, although we've established pretty closely. We have a good time even when we have differences of opinion. All of that to say, the purpose of this show is to talk about ideas, but also to, I hope, over the years that we are able to do this show, to emulate friendship, even across differences of opinion. So on behalf of all of us at Heritage, but certainly speaking for Kevin Roberts, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for that immensely gracious introduction. I keep waiting for the but.
There's none. There's none.
Okay, so
yeah,
I think we've accomplished what we need to do.
Okay, so this is a short episode. I have so many questions because you're also an eminently intelligent guy, and you have this new book, Conservatism or Rediscovery, which we'll talk quite a bit about today. Not exclusively, because there are a lot of things we want to cover beyond that. But before that, I'm a Southerner, and so before I can really even ask halfway decent, intelligent questions, I need to know about the person that I'm talking to. And I have gotten to know you a little bit, but perhaps there are some listeners or people watching this who know of you, but don't really know you. Tell us about Yoram Hazony. How'd you get here?
I was born in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a small child, my family moved to New Jersey. So people have been telling me, so you're an immigrant. I never thought about it quite like that. But yeah. So I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. Mm-hmm. I met my wife as an undergraduate. Those were the Reagan, Thatcher, John Paul II years.
Right. And
I know people don't usually think about those years that way today, but there was this intense religious nationalist revival going
mm-hmm.
on the Princeton campus, which swept up hundreds of kids, Christians and Jews. We founded a conservative magazine called the Princeton Tory.
Mm-hmm.
After I finished in college, I did a doctorate at Rutgers in political theory.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to Israel, and most of the next 30 years, Julie and I were raising 9 children, mm-hmm. Which was plenty, and we were focused on doing what we could for Israel and for Judaism. We felt like Israel was on the edge of the volcano,
right? And
that America looked strong.
Mm-hmm.
And a few years ago, that changed. Mm-hmm. And I remember vividly, spring of 2016, an older professor friend of mine from the United States contacted me, and he said, you got to drop whatever it is you're doing and gather together everything that you know about nationalism and put a book about it, put out a book now. And I like pulled my head out of the sand and looked around and realized he was right. And so now this become two books.
Right.
The first one about nationalism, and the second one about what it means to be a conservative and lead a conservative life. And that's created a really surprising demand, both in America and in Europe, for me to help talk about this, terrible crisis that the Western nations are going through, and that's how I've landed here in your company.
Well, thanks for responding to that friend's clarion call. I want to ask one follow-up question about that before we begin to dive into your book. And it is this: your friend encourages you to drop everything you're doing, read, research, write about nationalism. Both books are excellent. I actually, other than just the obligation of courtesy, don't have an obligation to say that. But by virtue of your being a guest here, and I'm a voracious reader of political theory and history, given my own background, this book that sits on my lap, Conservatism, is one of the finest that I've read about the history of our movement. But I'm going to come back to that. My question for you is, you respond to this clarion call. Was the situation in the United States as bad or worse than your friend depicted? I know it wasn't better.
I think it's significantly worse than.
I was afraid you would say that.
Than I imagined. Look, I mean, the truth is that there were voices, crying in the wilderness. One that comes to mind is Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind in 1987, I think, which said explicitly what's happening on the campuses is horrific, but it's the precursor to the campus expanding and devouring the whole culture in America. So that was an immensely successful book, and I read it, and lots of people read it, and you can say it was influential, but I just don't think any of us were. I mean, I just don't know anybody who was prepared either for the so-called resistance to the Trump administration and to Brexit in Britain, which was very much parallel. This resistance saying that that nationalism is now illegitimate, and it just has to be demonized. You can't cooperate with it. It's not part of the democratic system. So I don't think people were ready for that in 2016. And I don't think people were ready in 2020 for the immensely successful push by this woke neo-Marxist movement to take control of basically, I mean, the most important liberal institutions in the United States, from the New York Times to Princeton University. This puts us in. These two things put us on really unprecedented ground, and the earth is quaking beneath our feet. It really is, and America is precious to me, and it's important. But we should also understand that if America goes down, it's very likely it's going to take all the democratic nations with us.
That's right.
So, the stakes are basically, maximum.
Yeah. We have a situation in the world today where global elites, and I do mean that pejoratively, want to end the nation state, the concept of the nation state. And of course, America is squarely in the targets. We could go a lot of different directions based on that assertion that I just made. But the one we'll choose for now is that, as I think about your critique of America in particular, just the hastening pace of what we recognize as wokeism, you and I would recognize as academics. a very radical academic left that's been that way for a long time. It had been that way for basically a generation when Bloom wrote the book in 87. But the question is, we as conservatives were caught flat-footed. I mean, I'd like to think that some of us were caught flat-footed just in the pace of the advance of the radical left. But we know that we have some conservative friends, and certainly mean this fraternally, who have just been dismissive toward those of us who care deeply about faith and family and the distinguishing characteristics of what it is to be conservative. All of that to say, it has led you to be really involved, one of the leaders actually, of what's now known as the National Conservative Movement. And that ultimately is going to be the big thrust of our conversation today. But you and I, because we're immersed in this world, talk about these labels, these phrases, as if everyone in the world knows about them. But for someone who's listening or watching, who's very intrigued by what you've had to say, but isn't quite sure what national conservative means, explain that for them.
Sure. Well, first of all, the term, I mean, it's kind of redundant. I mean, the Anglo-American conservative tradition has had the idea of the nation and the reality of the nation, a world of nations and national independence, as one of its central pillars for many centuries. So, so like you, I would much rather just say conservative, and but the reason that at this moment we need to say national conservative is because for at least 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the term conservatism has been conflated with globalism. I mean,
that's right.
Many people who call themselves conservatives, when they say conservative, they're either referring to a personal libertarianism, just freedom is really the only important thing,
right?
Or they're referring to a globalist neoliberalism, which says not only is freedom the only important thing, but we know how the entire world should be governed, even to the point of imposing it on others.
Right.
And so those sort of twin versions of what calls itself conservatism, the libertarian version and the globalist version, those became so dominant in the last 30 years that when we started organizing these conferences for basically for dissenters. The first one we did was in December 2016, a month after Trump was elected, and when we started doing this, it was very obvious that you could say, well, we're the true conservatives, but that's so obnoxious.
Yeah,
it's just
it really is.
Some people talk like that. I can't stand it. It's just so offensive. So we just thought that, look, between neoconservatism, sort of in the center of the political map, and on the far right, there's all these groups that focus on race. So in the center, there are people who focus almost exclusively on the individual, and on the far right, there's people who focus on race. In between, there's this vast, gigantic space where the great majority of people who are intuitively conservative, who tend to vote conservative, the great majority are sitting in between in this gigantic space, and they didn't get the memo. They didn't know that the nation was, and national independence had, ceased to be central to conservatism. And so we decided that to distinguish neocons from natcons, just to make it clear that this is a change in direction, and that we're inviting people to join us in that change of direction. So we adopted national conservative or nationalist conservative, and basically what it means in short is no, it's not just about the individual and the entire globe. It's about the family. It's about the nation. It's about national interests and national traditions. And all of these things mean very real policy changes.
Thank you for that explanation. That I was smirking a little bit, in celebration of your persuasiveness, because what our audience will now know is you've been working on me recently to be less stubborn about my maxim that no adjective should be in front of the word conservative. So now you're laughing, and we could maybe get some comments from audience over the next months and years about that. But you make a persuasive case, and so we can move on from there. And how I would like to move on is to ask you the follow-up question that it seems as if just in our lifetimes, that what has replaced the concept of the nation state, properly defined in conservatism, has been the free market. And of course we love the free market, and be really clear that you do as well. But it seems as if those two things, concept of nation state or nationalism and free market, got inverted such that whether it's in foreign policy or domestic policy, to be a conservative, say from the late 80s or early 90s until the mid 2010s, was to place first and foremost, ahead of family, ahead of faith, ahead of all of these important institutions in life, the free market. Am I mistaken?
No, I think that's right. I would just add that that the view that the free market, which as you emphasize, I and all of my colleagues were raised on the free market. None of us are socialists.
Right.
None of us, think that there's some kind of ideal of, rational central planning that should govern any economy. I mean, we're not there, but I think a responsible conservatism has always been about balancing different principles, and that there are different formulations in the book. I look at the preamble of the American Constitution of 1787, and there's 7 different purposes of government there, and only one of them is individual liberty. So there are different formulations, but I think a simple, compelling way to think about it. Irving Kristol, who had a huge impact on me and my friends in the 1980s. Irving Kristol used to say that that modern conservatism rests on 3 pillars: religion, nationalism, and economic growth. And of the 3, he would say that religion is the most important. I mean, he's famous. He published a book called 2 Cheers for Capitalism. Yep. And it's not because he didn't appreciate the immense worth and importance of economic freedoms. He did. But everything needs to be balanced. And his argument was, and this is the same argument that I continue to make, and I think most of my colleagues do as well, is that it's utopian to believe that the single principle of individual liberties is capable of doing everything we need to do. And it's utopian. It's false. It's just not true. And so we need religion and the focus on the nation in order to give us the proper boundaries of the market, which you can't just figure it out by just reasoning about it. You need by experience to ask, what do we need to do in order to be able to conserve and transmit valuable, precious, important things from the past to future generations. And religion and nationalism, Kristol said, those are the 2 things that allow us to transmit things. Whereas the market, in and of itself, by itself, it has no loyalty to the past. It's always changing. I mean, that's what's good about it. Yep. But it also acts as a solvent. It actually, if it's the only principle, then it works to destroy the family and the nation. That's what we're seeing today. Well,
we really are. And heck, we could spend a couple of hours just diagnosing that. And again, just to be clear, for your sake, and for that matter, for mine and for all of us at Heritage, as an example, we're not denigrating the free market. We're just saying that for a generation or so, we conservatives have really misplaced it, that it really is at the service of the nation, at the service of the family, rather than the other way around. And so let's dive into the book here, published by Regnery. Our mutual friend Tom Spence, I know, was grateful to be able to do that. And here I just want to start with your comment about national conservatism. And you write, the nationalist aspect of Anglo-American conservatism does become more pronounced during periods when the integrity of the nation is directly challenged by an excessive internationalism, localism, or individualism. We've touched on that. You continue, the conservative movement in America and Britain after the mid-2010s is rightly called a nationalist conservatism, as you were just saying, since it seeks to return the national interest or the common good of the nation to the center of political discourse after decades in which the freedom of the individual became the overriding principle in all spheres of life. The thing I want to key in on there, because you've very eloquently touched on this in your comments already, is how we place this understanding of a national conservatism at the center of our political discourse. It seems difficult, not just because of the threats from the left, which you talk about at length in your book, but also because of a misunderstanding. And again, I say that in great charity and fraternity, by conservative friends. How do we fix it? I hope you've had enough coffee.
Yeah. How do we fix it? Look, the problem with fixing something like this, I mean, basically, again, to simplify, what we're saying is that the individual rights and liberties are crucial, but they need to be balanced by the family, the nation, religious tradition. Mm-hmm. And that kind of balance, that kind of change looks really awful to those people who've committed, who've dug in and mm-hmm. committed to the idea that, freedom in all things is basically what you need.
Right.
And it's a tough sell because mm-hmm. you're coming to people who say, look, just leave people alone, which, everybody says.
We love that concept, right?
I love that. Leave me alone. That's great. But we're coming to people who've been thinking about this, leave everybody alone thing for a long time. And the moment you start to say, well, look, there are limits. I mean, for example, we can't leave everybody alone when they're trying to cross America's southern border in the million. I mean, there has to be a border. That's not a liberal principle. That's a conservative principle. Or there have to be limits to the transferring of factories and technologies to China. I mean, it makes sense at the beginning, but eventually you're just building up this immense, potent rival which wants to destroy you. I mean, at some place it has to stop. Or pornography is it's not a small thing. It's a radical change for the way children grow up and the way adults live.
That's right.
To flood the world with any kind of addictive substances, but this one in particular, mm-hmm. which it is both involves the enslavement of people, mm-hmm. Men and women, in order to create it, and then does immense damage to families, to marriage. I mean, it just that kind of thing. There has to be a point where you can say, we through a mistaken mm-hmm. overemphasis on freedom, we've allowed an industry that's it's moving into hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's power. That power is used to influence us in all sorts of ways that we don't even necessarily understand.
That's right. In the name of freedom.
In the name of freedom. So I just gave 3 examples. There are many mm-hmm. more, and I guess we have to mention the high tech, the high tech thing, because it's just there's no common sense. No traditional conservative going back centuries would have said, the First Amendment's really important, but private companies ought to be able to take over the entire public political sphere and censor because they're private.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
it's
just
absurd on its face.
It's just absurd. But people who are committed to individual liberties only. I mean, they literally say, well, what can you do? Jack Dorsey created this company and it's a private company. Look, so it's hard to get people to change something so basic because they think, you're taking away my entire worldview, or worse, like you're selling authoritarianism. You're a social.
Right.
They think all these terrible things, and yet reality gets to decide in the end. And the reality is that a society that is built on all freedom all the time, with no constraints and no guardrails, is going to fail, and it's already failing.
It is, and in some catastrophic ways. Again, a lot of different ways we can go that wonderful response, but I want to perhaps inject a little bit of optimism, not in a hollow way. You're not interested in hollow optimism. I'm not, but I will say there's a certain resolve and a certain realistic cheerfulness among those of you who have been leaders in the national conservative movement, which doesn't surprise me because all of you have done such a great job of emphasizing the role of faith, which we'll come back to. But this is the point that I want to make for our audience. And it is that your understanding of history, my understanding of history, leads us to say all is not lost, that it actually is possible for us to reclaim nationalism, to reclaim some of the institutions in this country. You mention in the book that an important principle of Anglo-American conservative thought, as you write, is this: when faced with the disastrous consequences of a particular course of action, we must retrace our steps and restore, as much as possible, the conditions that existed prior to setting out on this course. You mentioned a few examples from history. Are you that optimistic in the 2020s that American conservatives will recognize the, I won't say folly, but we'll say the well-intentioned mistake of overemphasizing the market, overemphasizing globalism quickly enough for us to be more cohered to actually restore the institutions of this country?
Look, I'm not going to say I'm optimistic, but I'm not.
I couldn't get you there.
No, I'm not a pessimist either.
Yep.
I think you put your finger on it that if your framework is a biblical religious worldview, if that's your framework, then there's a couple things that one thing that is that human beings are really, really bad at seeing where things are going.
Yeah.
And almost nobody saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, there were maybe 2 guys out of the 10,000 people who were paid to know what was going on in the Soviet Union who saw in the 1980s what was coming. And the same thing is true for the rise of nationalism in 2016, or the collapse of the housing, market in 2008. We're terrible. We're terrible at seeing the future. So if you just sort of project out the current trends, then you see catastrophe. But that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. What's going to happen could be something very, very different. And I think religious people are, in a sense, more realistic about this. We can only do what we can do. We have to do everything we can do. We have to do everything that's in our power. But in the end, what's going to happen is it's not dependent just on what we did. In the end, God is going to decide whether we succeed or not. And so that's what we got to do. I mean, I think that's a reason to be cheerful. We know we're doing the right thing. We know that we're working to bring common sense and tradition and sanity to countries that have veered from that path. And there's no reason to be pessimistic. This is actually, it's a time of great upheaval and shifting and change. That also means it's a time of opportunity. And we just have to do everything we can to seize this opportunity to right the ship and put it back on course. And, we'll see. So one of the contributions you've made already, not just with this book, but with your other work, is reminding us
those of us who are conservatives, of the centrality, the essential nature of faith to our understanding. Would you explain that for people who in the audience may say, I'm a conservative, but I don't agree with you, Yoram and Kevin. That just can't be the case.
Sure. I think that the most important thing to understand about when you approach this topic is that there is no society, small, medium, or large. There are no human societies that don't have some kind of public philosophy or public religion. There's a basic framework that every human society has. Sometimes it's worked out explicitly by theorists, and sometimes it's not worked out explicitly. It's implicit, and you have to look for it in order to understand what it is. But it's always there. There are no societies that are different from that. And in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a movement in the United States and Britain and across Europe after World War II to say, the neutral state is the answer. How can we just in one stroke get rid of all the evils in the past? And the answer is to be, neutral, to not distinguish, to not discriminate, right? I mean, that, not discriminating, not persecuting Black Americans. That's an extremely important goal. And they were right to pursue it. But the general idea that the state can be neutral, it shouldn't make any distinctions, between men and women, between, Christians, Jews, and atheists, no distinctions. That became that post World War II version of liberalism, which eliminated God and Scripture from the school system in the name of equality and liberty. That framework lasted for 60 years as sort of like the dominant framework from the 1960s till the 2010s, and now its hegemony has collapsed. It is proved that it cannot sustain itself for more than 2 generations. It is proved that it does not have the strength to fight the woke movement, which is demolishing liberalism in America and Britain and is seeking to impose its own hegemony. So when you look at this, I think, a common sense thing to say is liberalism, post-1960s, post-World War II, 1960 style liberalism did not have what it takes to transmit itself over generations, and it did not have what it takes to fend off the attacks from the far left. So what do we have? And I think a simple answer is, we have biblical religion. We have 2,000 years of Christianity and 3,000 years of Judaism, and these are fundamental frameworks. I obviously understand if people are skeptical. We've been raised that way, but these frameworks have the ability to create a stability and a healthy life for civilization. And everybody's responsibility, if they have a conservative bone in their body and they want to go back to conserving and transmitting things, then they've got to face this reality, which is that Christianity and Judaism have something that liberalism didn't have, and I think that a reconstructed public culture, public philosophy based on Christianity and the Bible, I think that's the only force that realistically can actually fight and defeat what we're facing. So people who weren't raised with this and don't fully understand it, they should give it a think. And that's part of the plea of the book is there's lots of really good reasons not to dismiss religion because it's the only thing that we know has the potential to actually do what we need here.
Well, you make a strong historical appeal there. You've been using a few times the word framework. And I would think that thoughtful people, especially if they're taken by the other elements of your book, would really give that a think, as you say. But I want to push you, but in a friendly way, from a friend, for solutions. And not to put you on the spot, but I'm genuinely curious in what you'd say. Is the solution to that, considering that every year Pew does this study of the United States and its religiosity, we're seeing the percentage of Americans who are nuns, from this Catholic, not an N-U-N nun, but an N-O-N-E nun, increasing. It'd be perfectly fine with me if we see an increase in nuns. But the point is that it seems as if we're really swimming upstream. And so do you think that the solution for that is within policy and politics? Or is it mostly outside policy and politics? And just one specific postscript to that question is there some federal policy that needs to be modified to facilitate that work of rehabilitating religiosity?
Yeah, well, the answer is both.
Okay.
We are talking about we're thinking about how it's possible for there to be a restoration, a revival. That can only happen with with some repentance.
Right.
So there's a national version of it, and there's a personal version of it. At the national level, I think, for the reasons you mentioned, it's completely unrealistic and undesirable at this stage to be, thinking, in terms of some kind of federal level, national level, reinstitution of religion. It's not going to happen. But what could happen is for those regions, those states and localities in the United States, and there still are such places where there is a Christian majority, or where there's a pro-Christian majority.
That'd be a good way of putting it.
Yeah, people who see what's coming and they say, let's go into alliance with the Christians and see what we can do. In those states, in those places where that's still possible, I'm saying that should be the goal. In other words, we need to understand a little bit of history. That separation of church and state was not the policy of the federal government in the United States until 1947.
Right.
It's only after World War II and sort of the traumatic reaction to the world wars, that's the first time that you see the American Supreme Court intervening across, all the states in the United States to begin blanket removal of any kind of religion from the public sphere. And by the 1960s, that means, no God, no prayer, no scripture in the schools, and from there, throughout society. So the first policy point is that American constitutional history gives ample support for the idea that there can be a public religion at the level of the states, and that could mean different things in different states. I mean, we'd have to imagine that we're not talking about reinstituting the official Congregationalist Church in Massachusetts, but there may be states where Protestants and Catholics and some Orthodox Jews and other sympathetic people would design a religious public culture to give public expression to a religious life, and that could be developed as an experiment. Right? Different states will do it differently. Sure. An experiment in restoration, an experiment in saying, like what you read before, that we did take a wrong turn.
Yeah.
In 1947, certainly by the 1960s, there was a wrong turn. And we have to retrace our steps on some issues. Mm-hmm. And the key to the whole thing is, look, Christianity in America is, to a large extent, I'm saying this as a sympathetic outsider, mm-hmm. Not a Christian. Christianity in America it feels defeated. Mm-hmm. It feels there's a tremendous amount of lack of hope, mm-hmm. and the key is to be able to turn that switch in our private lives and in our thinking about the public mm-hmm. sphere, and say, look, there's no grounds for hopelessness. We just got to do what we got to do, and that means that we have to stop being embarrassed about talking about the Bible. Yeah. We have to stop being embarrassed in talking about God. These are good things, and they're much, much better than the alternative, which we've seen plenty of.
We've lived through, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's extremely well said. And it's a wonderful segue into the last question I have about your book, or last comment that I'll make. And I mean this genuinely, more than just the professional position I have, or someone who has spent a lot of time studying the history of conservatism and certainly history of the country. I'm really taken in a positive way by your focus on living a conservative life. Because as I reread every couple of years a book that was instrumental in my own formation as a conservative, The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, there's really very little explicit in The Conservative Mind, although Kirk was a wonderful personification of his principles about that. I think about something more recent, our friend Arthur Brooks and his book, The Conservative Heart. Beautiful book, great guy. But you really focus on this in the same book in which you as a political theorist do a wonderful job of giving us an intellectual history of our movement. All of that to say, I want to read one last excerpt from your book. And this is in the conclusion, the very beginning of it. You say, a distinctive hardship attends the lives of men and women who have grown up in liberal societies, whose traditions, whether Christian or Jewish, were overthrown a few generations earlier. Having been told all their lives that they are free to choose whatever course they please, they find it increasingly difficult to choose any course at all. What you're appealing to is not just the mind, but the heart.
Yes.
Respond to that.
Well, I just don't look. I don't think that conservatism, a public conservatism, can work without a private conservatism. Mm-hmm. And I say this because I know many wonderfully intelligent, highly motivated young conservatives. I mean, this is true for the older ones too, but that many of the young conservatives think that if they say the right things and push for the right things, if they push for family friendly policies, or if they work to ban abortion. Mm-hmm. These are good things to do, but they think that if they do those things, then it's okay to lead a completely liberal personal life. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is so many of the young conservatives who I admire and come into contact with, a guy's 35 years old. He's not married. He's been living with his girlfriend for years and years. Mm-hmm. And neither of them really really feels like there's anything wrong with the fact that they have no children. They're not members of a congregation. They live, on the other side of, they live 2,000 miles away from their families. Mm-hmm. And so that they basically, they have no roots. They have no community. They don't have Sabbaths where they can, go be with the congregation and be part of the chain of transmission. Mm-hmm. for the Sabbath. They go to the beach instead. It's a perfectly fine thing to do, to go to the beach. But look, nobody's fooled by this. I mean, the real impact that you have is on the people around you in your life. People hear you saying conservative things, but they see you leading a liberal life. So all you're doing is inspiring them to lead a liberal life. That's really what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so, look, repentance has to be at the heart of any biblically framed understanding of things. It has to begin with the individual saying, with a young man or a young woman or an old man or an old woman saying, I'm going in the wrong direction. I'm on the wrong track. I'm pushing the whole world around me on the wrong track because I'm on the wrong track. I have to change course.
Yeah.
And that means plugging back in to those communities, mostly Orthodox congregations at this point, Christian and Jewish, to plug into those communities where conservation and transmission is not something you talk about. It's happening every day. It's a skill that you need to pick up by being a member of this kind of community.
Yeah. Well, we're going to leave it there for now. I was tempted to ask you another question, but we'll just have you back, hopefully many times over the years. And I just want to say thank you for all of your work. Thanks for what's been a wonderful conversation. I look forward to many more. Yoram Hazony, you're just a great patriot, a great man, and you've taught us a lot. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Kevin.
For those of you who make this show possible, thank you. I suspect you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Of course, we'll have Yoram back sometime, but in the meantime, on the next episode, we'll have another great thinker, another great motivator, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.